Like crap. Voice is going out. I'm just not even caring today. Cough drop my health. I'm gonna read. I do believe we're on chapter 3. I'll find out here in a second. On my little bookmark. It is. It's a little magnetic one. Kind of cute. Yes, we are in chapter 3. The arrow tells me where I'm reading. And put your page between the magnets. 6. So it's really nice. It doesn't fall out. Doesn't go anywhere. I don't have to worry about losing it. Well, I have to worry about losing it when it's not where it needs to be. Other than that, I don't. If I can get through the chapter or not. Probably not. Just pages. But we are going to read. We are on chapter 3. And up until now, remember, we've lost 2 people. There are people trying to get out. Top Collie has got Peter Jackson dead. And we found out before that, Carver's girl, their daughter, Kirsten, Airs, had been killed as well. So, and remember what I was telling you is Desperation and the Regulators go hand in hand. They were published at the same time, hand in hand. And it is because they are parallel universes, parallel dimensions, parallel whatever you want to call it. They're in different universes because the characters here are in Regulators, vice versa. And the same bad guy is in there. And we will find out about him later, I'm sure. And so it's really, really weird to see these people in a different light and know that, oh, they didn't move here. This is something different. So to see these characters, I guess it would kind of like be somebody who wrote fan fiction and included characters, except for these are well-known writers. Richard Bachman did The Regulators, and Stephen King did the Desperation, and they are both one and the same, but it is. Let's see what we got today. The man who had once been on the cover of People and Time and Premiere, when he married the actress with all the emeralds, front page of the New York Times, when he won the National Book Award for his novel Delight, then the center spread of Inside You, when he was arrested for beating up his third wife, the one for the actress with the emeralds, had to take a piss. He pulled his motorcycle over to the westbound edge of Highway 50, working methodically down through the gears, stiff left foot, and finally rolling to a stop on the edge of the tar. Good thing there was so little traffic out here, because you couldn't park your scoot off the road in the Great Basin even if you had once fucked America's most famous actress. Although she had admittedly been a little long in the tooth by then, and had been spoken of in connection with the Nobel Prize for Literature. If you tried it, your bike was apt to first heel over on her kickstand and then fall flat on her road bars. The shoulder looked hard, but that was mostly attitude. Not much different from the attitudes of certain people he could name, including one he needed a mirror to get a good look at. And try picking up a 700-pound Harley once you dumped it, especially when you were 5'6" and out of shape. Let's try. Yeah, no. I don't think so, he thought, looking at the red and cream Harley Softail. A street bike at which any pursuit would have turned up his nose. Oh, purist. A street bike at which any purist would have turned up his nose. Listening to the engine tick-tock in the silence. The only other sounds were the hot wind and the minute sound of sand backing against his leather jacket. $200 at Barney's in New York. A jacket meant to be photographed by a fag from Interview magazine, if ever there had been one. I think we'll skip that part entirely, shall we? Fine by me, he said. Took off his helmet, put it on the Harley seat. Then he rubbed a slow hand down his face, which was as hot as the wind and at least twice as sunburned. He thought he had never felt quite so tired, so out of his element in his whole life. Part 2. Literary lion walked stiffly into the desert, his long gray hair brushing against the shoulders of the motorcycle jacket. Scrubbing mesquite and paintbrush ticking against his chaps, also from Barney's. He looked around carefully and saw nothing coming in his direction. There was something parked off the road a mile or two further west, a truck or maybe a motorhome. But even if there were people in it, he doubted that they would watch the great man take a leak without binoculars. And if they were watching, so what? It was a trick more people knew after all. He unzipped his fly, John Edward Marin, man Harper's had once called the writer Norman Mailer always wanted to be. Man Shelby Foote had once called the only living American writer of John Steinbeck's stature, and hauled out his original fountain pen. He had to piss like a racehorse, but for almost a minute nothing happened. He just stood there with his dry dick in his hand. I'm glad there's disclaimer. Then at last, urine arced out and turned the tough and dusty leaves of the mesquite a darker, shiny green. Praise Jesus, thank you, Lord, he bellowed in his rolling, trembling, Jimmy swaggered voice. It was a great success at cocktail parties. Tom Wolfe had once laughed so hard when he was doing the evangelist voice that Johnny thought the man was going to have a stroke. Water in the desert, there's a big 10-4. That's a big 10-4. Hello, Julia. He sometimes thought it was this version of Hallelujah, not his insatiable appetite for booze, drugs, and younger women, that had caused the famous actress to push him into a pool during a drunken press conference at the Bel Air Hotel, and then to take her emeralds elsewhere. That incident hadn't marked the beginning of his decline, but it had marked the point where the decline had become impossible to. He wasn't just having a bad day or a bad year anymore. He was sort of having a bad life. The picture of him climbing out of the pool in his sopping white suit, a big drunk's grin on his face, had appeared in Esquire, Boys, Archivements issue, and after that had commenced his more or less regular appearances in Spy magazine. Spy was the place he'd come to believe where once legitimate reputations. At least this afternoon, as he stood facing north and with his shadow stretched out long to the right, those thoughts didn't hurt as much as they sometimes did, and as they always did in New York, where everything hurt these days. The desert had a way of making Shakespeare's bubble reputation seem not only fragile, but irrelevant. And when you had become a kid of literary Elvis Presley, aging over, a kind of literary Elvis Presley, aging overweight, and still at the party long after you should have gone home, that wasn't such a bad thing. He spread his legs even wider, bent slightly at the waist, and let go of his penis so he could massage his lower back. He had been told that doing this helped sustain the flow a little longer, and he had an idea that it did, but he knew he still He would still have to take a leak again long before he got to Austin, which was the next little Nevada chit splat on a long road to California. His prostate clearly wasn't what it used to be. When he thought about it these days, often pictured a bloated, crenellated thing that looked like a radiation baked giant brain in a 50s drive-in horror movie. Why can I imagine that? He should have it checked. He knew that. And not as an isolated event, but as part of a complete soup to nuts physical. Of course he should, but hey, it wasn't as if he were pissing blood or anything. Besides. Well, alright. He was scared. That was the besides. There was a lot more to what was wrong with him than just the way his literary reputation had gone slipping through his fingers during the last 5 years, and quitting the pills and booze hadn't improved things as he'd hoped. In some ways, quitting had made things worse. The trouble with sobriety, John found, that you remembered all the things you had been scared of. He was afraid that the doctor might find more than a prostate roughly the size of a brain from planet Eros. Eros? A-R-O. When he stuck his finger into the literary lion's nether region. He was afraid that the doctor might find a prostate that was as black as a decayed pumpkin and as cancerous as Frank Zappa's head. And even if cancer wasn't lurking there, it might be lurking. The lung, why not? He'd smoked 2 packs of Camels every day for 20 years, and 3 packs of Camel Lights for another 10. As if smoking Camel Lights was going to fix everything somehow. Spruce up his bronchial tubes, polish his trachea, refurbish his poor, sludge-caked alveoli. Well, bullshit. He'd been off the cigarettes for 10 years now, and the light as well as heavy. But he still wheezed like an old cart horse until at least noon. Sometimes he woke himself up coughing in the middle of the night. Or the stomach. Yeah, why not there? Soft, pink, trusting, the perfect place disaster to strike. He had been raised in a family of ravenous meat eaters, where medium rare meant the cook had breathed hard on the steak. The concept of well done was unknown. He loved hot sauces and hot peppers. He did not believe in fruits and salads unless one was badly constipated. He'd eaten like that his whole fucking life, still ate like that, and would probably go on eating like that until they slammed him into a hospital bed, started feeding him all the right things for plastic tube. The brain. Possible. Quite possible. Tumor, or maybe here was an especially cheerful thought, an unseasonably early case of Alzheimer's. Pancreas? Well, that one was fast at least. Express service, no waiting. Heart attack? Cirrhosis? Stroke? How likely they all sounded. How logical. In many interviews, he had identified himself as a man outraged by death. That was pretty much the same old big balls crap he'd been selling throughout his career. He was terrified of death. That was the truth. And as a result of spending his life honing his imagination, he could see it coming far from at least 4 dozen different. And late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he was apt to see. I don't know why that. He was apt to see it coming from 4 dozen different directions at once. Refusing to see a doctor, to have a checkup, and let them peek under the hood would not cause any of those diseases to pause in their approach or their feeding upon him, if indeed the feeding had already begun, and if he stayed away from the doctors and their devilish machines, wouldn't have to know. You didn't have to deal with the monster under the bed or lurking in the corner if you never really turned on the bedroom. That was the thing. And what no doctor in the world seemed to know was that men like Johnny Marinville, fearing was sometimes better than fighting, especially when you'd put out the welcome mat, every disease going, including AIDS. Continuing to stare out at the desert, he had tried to be careful, and he didn't get laid as much as he used to anyway. That was a painful truth. And he knew that for the last 8 or 10 months, he had been careful because the blackouts had stopped with drinking. But in the year before he'd quit, there had been 4 or 5 occasions where he had simply awakened next to some anonymous jam. One of each of these occasions he had gotten up and gone immediately into the bathroom to check the toilet. Once there had been a used condom floating in there, so that was probably okay. On the other occasions, Filch, of course, he and his friend, his gal pal and tabloidees, might have flushed it down in the night, but you couldn't know for sure, could you? Not when you'd progressed to the blackout stage and AIDS. That shit gets in there and waits, he said. Then winced as a particularly vicious gust of wind drove a fine sheet of alkali dust against his cheek, his neck, and his hanging organ. This latter had quit doing anything useful at least a full minute ago. Johnny shook it briskly, then slipped it back into his underpants. Brethren, said, told the distant, shimmering mountains in his earnest revival preacher's voice. We are told in the book of Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 9, that it matters not how much you jump and dance. The last 2 drops go in your pants. So it is written, and so it is. No, no. Oh boy, I am so. You know what? I really now want to go look that up. That is so wrong of me. But okay. So we got 3, 9. And to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God. That is not kind of work. And to make all see what is the fellowship of mystery, which from the beginning of the ages has been hidden and created all things through Jesus. That's what it is. But it was still, no matter how much you jump and dance, the drops go. So it is written. So it is. That's great. He was turning around, zipping his fly, talking mostly to keep the megrims away. They had been gathering like vultures just lately, these megrims. And now he stopped doing everything at once. There was a police cruiser parked behind his motorcycle. Blue flashers turning lazily in the hot desert daylight. Wait, what the heck are megrims? Depression, low. Ah, to keep spirits high. Okay, see. All right. Part 3. It was his first wife who provided Johnny Marinville with what might be his last chance. Oh, not his last chance to publish his work. Shit, no. He would be able to go on doing that as long as he remained capable of A, putting words on paper, and B, sending them off to his agent. Once you'd been accepted as a bona fide literary lion, someone would be glad to go on publishing your words, even after they had degenerated into self parody or outright drivel. Johnny sometimes thought that the most terrible thing about the American literary establishment was how they let you swing in the wind, slowly strangling, while they all stood around at their asshole cocktail parties, congratulating themselves on how kind they were being to poor old what's his name. No, what Terry gave him wasn't his last chance to publish, but maybe his last write something really worthwhile. Something that would get him noticed again in a positive way. Something that might also sell like crazy. And he could use the money. There was no doubt about that. Best of all, he didn't think Terry had the slightest idea what she had said, which meant he wouldn't have to share any of the proceeds with her, if proceeds there were. He wouldn't even have to mention her on the acknowledgments page if he didn't want to. And he supposed he probably would. Sobering up had been a terrifying experience in many ways, but it did help a person remember. He had married Terry when he was 25. She was 21, junior at Vassar. She had never finished college. They had been married for almost 20 years. During that time, she had borne him 3 children, all grown now. One of them, Ronan, still talked to him. The other 2, well, if they ever got tired of cutting off their noses and to spite their faces, he would be around. He was not by nature a vindictive man. Harry seemed to know that. After 5 years, during which their only communication had been through lawyers, they had begun a cautious dialogue, sometimes by letter, more often by telephone. These communications had been tentative at first, both of them afraid of minds still buried in the ruined city of their affections, but over the years, they had become more regular. Harry regarded her famous ex with a kind of stoic, amused interest that he found depressing somehow. It was not, in his opinion, the sort of attitude his ex-wife was supposed to have for a man who had gone on to become one of the most discussed writers of his generation. But she also spoke to him with a straightforward kindness that he found soothing, like a cool hand on a hot brow. They had been in contact more since he'd quit drinking, but still always by phone or by letter. Both of them seemed to know, even without discussing it, that meeting face to face would put too much pressure on the fragile bond they had forged. But in some ways, these sober conversations had been even more dangerous. Not acrimonious, but always with that possibility. She wanted him to go back to Alcoholics Anonymous, told him bluntly that if he didn't, he'd eventually start drinking again, and the drugs would follow, she said, as surely as dark follows after twilight. Johnny told her he had no intention of spending the rest of his life sitting in church basements with a bunch of drunks, all of them talking about how wonderful it was to have the power greater than oneself, before getting back into their old cars and driving home to their mostly spouseless houses to feed their cats. People in AA are generally too fundamentally broken to see that they've turned their lives over to an empty concept and a failed ideal. Take it from me, I've been there. Take it from John Cheever, if you like. He wrote particularly well about that. John Cheever isn't writing much these days, Harry replied. I think you know why, too. Harry could be irritating, no doubt about that. It was 3 months ago that she had given him the great idea, tossing it off in a casual conversation that had rambled through what the kids were up to, she was up to, and of course, what he was up to. What he had been up to in the early part of this year was agonizing over the first 200 pages of a historical novel by Jay Gould. He had finally seen it for what it was, warmed over, bore vital, crushed it, baked it, actually. In a fit of peak he had resolved to keep entirely to himself. He had tossed his computer storage disks for the novel into the microwave and given them 10 minutes on high. The stench had been unbelievable, a thing that had come roaring out of the kitchen with quills on it. And he actually had to replace the microwave. I can imagine. Then he found himself telling Terry the whole thing. When he finished, he sat in his office chair with the phone pressed against his ear and his eyes closed, waiting for her to tell him not to bother with resuming AA meetings, that what he needed was a good shrink in a hurry. Instead, she said he should have put the discs in a casserole dish and used the convection oven. He knew she was joking and that she thought at least part of the joke was on him, but her acceptance of the way he was and how he behaved still felt like a cool hand on a fevered brow. It wasn't approval he got from her, but approval wasn't what he wanted. Of course, you never were much good in the kitchen, she said, and her matter of fact tone made him laugh out loud. So what are you going to do now, Johnny? Any idea? Not the slightest. You ought to write some nonfiction. Get away from the whole idea of a novel for a while. That's dumb, Terry. I can't write nonfiction, and you know it. I know nothing of the kind, she said, speaking in a sharp, don't be a fool tone he got from no one else these days, at least of all from his agent. The more Johnny flopped and flailed around, the more gruesomely obsequious, ill hairs become, it seemed. During the first 2 years we were married, you must have written at least a dozen essays. Published them, too. Good money. Life, Harper's, even a couple in the New Yorker. Easy for you to forget. You weren't the one who did the shopping and paid the bills. I loved the puppies. Oh, the so-called American Heart essays? Right. I didn't forget 'em, Terry. I blocked 'em out. Brent Payers, after the last of the Guggenheim, Uggenheim, Guggenheim. Joe was gone. That's basically what they were. They've never even been collected. Hi, how are you? Are you going to sit and read with me? What? Outside. Didn't pay you. You wouldn't allow them to be collected, she retorted. They didn't fit your golden idea of immortality. Johnny greeted this with silence. Sometimes he hated her memory. She'd never been able to write worth a shit herself. The stuff she'd been turning in to her honors writing seminar the year he had met her, had been just horrible. And since then, never published anything more complex than a letter to the editor. But she was a champ at data storage. I had to give her that. You there, Johnny? I'm here. I always know when I'm telling you stuff you don't like, she said brightly. Because it's the only time you ever shut up. Get all broody. Well, I'm here, repeated heavily, and fell silent again, hoping she would change the subject. She didn't, of course. You did 3 or 4 of these essays because someone asked for them. Remember who? Miracle, he had thought. Didn't remember who. And I'm sure you would have stopped there, except by then you were getting queries from other editors. It didn't surprise me a bit. Those essays were good. He was silent this time, not to indicate disinterest or disapproval, but because he was thinking back, trying to remember if they had been any good. Harry couldn't be trusted 100% when it came to such questions. But you couldn't throw her conclusions out of court without a hearing. As a fiction writer, she'd been of the I saw a bird at sunrise and my heart leaped up. But as a critic, she had been tough as nails and capable of insights which were spooky, almost like telepathy. One of the things that had attracted him to her, although he supposed the fact that she had the best breasts in America back in those days had helped matters along, was the dichotomy between what she wanted to do, write fiction, and what she was able to do. which was to write criticism that could cut like a diamond. As for the so-called American Heart essays, the only one he could remember clearly after all these years was Death on the Second Shift. It had been about a father and son working together in the Pittsburgh steel mill. In a Pittsburgh steel mill. Father had had a heart attack and died in his son's arms the third day of Johnny Marinville's 4-day research job. He had meant to focus on a fairly different aspect of mill work, but had changed course at once and without a second thought. The result had been a wretchedly sentimental piece. The fact that every word was true hadn't changed that in the slightest, but it had been a tremendously popular piece. Men who edited it for life dropped him a note 6 weeks later that it generated the fourth largest volume of letters in the magazine's history. Other stuff started to come back to him. Titles like Feeding the Flames, A Kiss on Lake Saranac. Terrible titles, but fourth largest. Where might these old essays be? In Marinville collection at Fordham? Possible. Hell, they might even be in the attic of the cottage in Connecticut. He wouldn't mind a look at them. Maybe they could be updated, or something began to nibble at the back of his mind. You still have your scoot, Johnny? Huh? Barely heard her. Your scoot, your ride, your motorcycle? Sure, he said. I stored it in the garage out at Westport we used to use. You know, the one. Gibby's. Yeah, Gibby's. Someone different owns it now, but it used to be Gibby's garage. Yeah. He had been blindsided by a brilliantly textured memory. Me and Terry, fully clothed and petting like mad behind Gibby's garage one afternoon in, well, a long ago, leave it at that. A long time ago, leave it at that. Terry had been wearing a pair of tight blue shorts. He doubted if her mother would have approved of them. God, no. But he himself had thought those discount store specials made her look like a queen of the Western world. Her ass was only good, but her legs, and those legs had gone not just up to her chin, all the way out to Arcturus and beyond. Arcturus. How had they gotten out? How had they gotten out there in the first place among cast off tires and rusty engine parts, standing hip deep in sunflowers and feeling each other up? He couldn't remember, but he remembered the rich curve of her breast in his hand and how she'd gripped the belt loops of his jeans when he cried out against her neck, calling him closer as he could come tight, calling him closer so he could come tight and hard against her taut belly. He dropped a hand into her lap, wasn't exactly surprised at what he had found there. Hey, folks, Crampton comes alive. New bunch? Or maybe even a book? He settled his hand firmly back in the arm of the chair. Huh? What? Are you going deaf as well as senile? No, I was remembering one time with you behind Gibby's making out. Oh, and the sunflowers? Right, right. There was a long pause, and she might have been considering some further comment in the interlude. Johnny was almost hoping for one. Instead, she came back with a previous scripture. Came back to her previous scripture. I said maybe you ought to drive across the country on your bike before you get too old to work the foot gears and start drinking again and splash yourself all over the back hills. Are you out of your mind? I haven't been on that thing in 3 years. I have no intention of getting back on, Terry. My eyesight sucks. So, get a stronger pair of glasses. And my reflexes are shot. John Cheever may or may not have died of alcoholism, but John Gardner definitely went out on a motorcycle. Had an argument with a tree. He lost. Happened on a road in Pennsylvania. One I've driven myself. Terry wasn't listening. She was one of a few people in the world who felt perfectly comfortable ignoring him and letting her own thoughts carry her away. He supposed that was another reason he divorced her. He didn't like being ignored, especially by a woman. You could cross the country on your motorcycle and collect material for a new bunch of essays, she was saying. She sounded both excited and amused. If you front loaded the best of the early bunch as part one, you'd have a pretty good sized book. American Heart, 1966 to 1996. Essays by John Edward Marin giggled. Who knows? You might even get another good notice from Shelby Foote. That's the one you always liked the best, wasn't it? She paused for his reply. When it didn't come, she asked him if he was there, first lightly, and then with a little concern. Yes, he said, I'm here. She was suddenly glad he was sitting down. Listen, Terry, I have to go. I've got an appointment. New lady friend? Diatrist, he said. Thinking foot, thinking foot. That name was like the final number in a blank vault combination. Click, and the door swings open. Well, take care of yourself, she said. And honest to God, Johnny, think about getting back to AA. I mean, what can it hurt? Nothing, I suppose, he said, thinking about Shelby Foote, who had once called John Edward Marinville the only living American writer of John Steinbeck's stature. Harry was right. All the praise nuggets he'd ever gotten, that was the one he liked the best. Right. Nothing. Paused. Johnny, are you all right? As you sound like you're there. Fine, say hello to the kids for me. I always do. They usually respond with what my mama used to call potty words, but I always do. Bye. He hung up without looking at the telephone, and when it fell off the edge of the desk and onto the floor, still didn't look around. John Steinbeck had crossed the country with his dog and his makeshift camper. Johnny had a barely used 1340cc Harley Davidson Softail, stored out in Connecticut, not American Heart. She was wrong about that, but not just because it was the name of a Jeff Bridges movie from a few years back. Not American Heart, but Travels with Harley, he murmured. It was a ridiculous title, a laughable title, like a Mad Magazine parody, but was it any worse than the essay titled Death, Second Shift, or Feeding the Flames? He thought not, and he felt the title would work, would rise above its puny origins. He had always trusted his intuitions, and he hadn't had one as strong as this in years. He could cross the country on his red and cream Softail from the Atlantic where it touched Connecticut, to the Pacific where it touched California. A book of essays that might cause the critics entirely think their image. A book of essays that might even get him back to the bestsellers list. If, if it was big-hearted, he said. His heart was thumping hard in his chest, but for once the feel of that didn't scare him. Big-hearted like blue highways, hearted like Steinbeck. Sitting there in his office with the telephone burring harshly at his feet. What Johnny Marinville had seen was nothing less than redemption, a way out. He had scooped the telephone up and called his agent, fingers flying over the buttons. Bill? It's Johnny. I was just sitting here thinking about some essays I wrote when I was a kid, and I had a fantastic idea. It's gonna sound crazy at first, but hear me out. Part 4. As Johnny made his way up the sandy slope to the highway, trying not to pant too much, he saw the guy standing behind his Harley and writing down the plate number was the biggest damn chunk of cop he'd ever seen. 6'6" at least, and at least 270 pounds on the hoof. Afternoon, officer, Johnny said. He looked down at himself and saw a tiny dark spot on the crotch of his Levi's. No matter how much you jump and dance, he thought. Sir, are you aware that parking a vehicle on the state road is against the law? The cop asked without looking up. No, but I hardly think it can be much of a problem on the road as deserted as US 50. How he meant to finish. And in the haughty, how dare you question my judgment tone that he had been using on underlings and service people for years. But then he saw something. There was blood on the right cuff and sleeve of the cop's shirt. Quite a lot of it, drying now to the glaze, to a maroon glaze. He had probably finished moving some large piece of roadkill off the highway not very long ago, likely a deer, an elk hit by a speeding semi. That would explain both the blood and the bad temper. The shirt looked like a dead loss. That much blood would never come out. Sir? Pop asked sharply. He had finished writing down the plate number now and went on looking at the bike, his blond eyebrows drawn together, his mouth crimped flat. It was as if he didn't want to look at the bike's owner, as if he knew that would only make him feel lousier than he already did. Than he did already. You were saying? Nothing, officer, Johnny said. He spoke in a neutral tone, not humble, but not haughty either. He didn't want to cross this big lug when he was clearly having a bad day. Still, without looking up, his notepad strangled in one hand and his gaze fixed severely on the Harley's taillight, the cop said, "It's also against the law to relieve yourself in sight of a state road. You know that?" "No, I'm sorry," Johnny said. He felt like a he felt a wild urge to laugh bubbling around in his chest and suppressed it. "Well, it is. Now I'm going to have to let you go." He looked up for the first time, looked at Johnny, and his eyes widened. Go with a warning this time, but he trailed off, eyes now as wide as a kid's when the circus parade came thumping down the street, and the swirl of clowns and trombones. Johnny knew the look, although he had never expected to see it out here in the Nevada desert, and on the face of a gigantic Scandinavian cop who looked as if as if his reading tastes might run the gamut of from Playboy's party jokes to Guns and Ammo magazine. "Fan," he thought. "I'm out here in the big nowhere between Eli and Austin, and I found a by God fan." He couldn't wait to tell Steve Ames about this when they met up in Austin. Well, he might call him on the cellular later on this afternoon. If the cellulars worked out here, that was. Now that he thought about it, he supposed they didn't. The battery in his was up. He'd had it on the charge all last night. But he hadn't actually talked to Steve on the damn thing leaving Salt Lake City. In truth, he wasn't all that crazy about cellulars. Cellular. He didn't think they actually did cause cancer. That was probably just more tabloid scare stuff. But holy shit, the cop muttered. His right hand, the one below the bloodstained cuff and sleeve, went up to his right cheek. For one bizarre moment, he looked at Johnny like a pro football going to, lineman doing a Jack Berry riff. "Holy shit!" "What's the trouble, officer?" Johnny asked. He was with some difficulty suppressing a. One thing hadn't changed over the years. He loved to be recognized. God, how he loved it. "You're John Edward Marinville," the cop gasped, running it all together, as if he really had only one name, like Pile or Canton. The cop was not starting to grin himself, and Johnny thought, "Oh, Mr. Police, what big have? I mean, you aren't you? You wrote Delight and oh shit, Song of the Hammer. I'm standing right next to a guy who wrote Song of the Hammer." And then he did something which Johnny found genuinely endearing. Reached out and touched the sleeve of his motorcycle jacket, as if to prove the man wearing it was actually real. "Holy shit!" "Well, yes, I'm Johnny Marinville," he said. speaking in the modest tones he reserved for these occasions, and these occasions only, as a rule. Although I have to tell you that I've never been recognized by someone who's just watched me take a leak by the side of the road. Oh, forget that, the cop said. Seized Johnny's hand. For just a moment before the cop's fingers closed over his, Johnny saw that the man's hand was also smeared with half-dried blood. Both lifeline and love line stood out a dark, liverish red. Johnny tried to keep his smile in place as they shook, though he did pretty well, and thought he did pretty well, but he was aware that the corners of his mouth seemed to have gained weight. Getting on me, he thought, and there won't be any place to wash it off before Austin. Man, the cop was saying, you are one of my favorite writers. I mean, gosh, Song of the Hammer. I know the critics didn't like it, but what do they know? Not much, Johnny said. He wished the cop would let go of his hand, and the cop was apparently one of the people who shook for punctuation and emphasis as well as greeting. Johnny could feel the latent strength of the cop's grip. The big guy squeezed down. His forever writer would be keyboarding his new book left-handed, at least for the first month or two. Not much, damn straight. Song of the Hammer's the best book about Vietnam I ever read. Forget Tim O'Brien or Robert Stone. Well, thank you very much. The cop finally loosened his grip and Johnny retrieved his hand. He wanted to look down at it, see how much blood was on it, but this clearly wasn't the time. The cop was sticking his abused notebook into his back pocket again, staring at Johnny in a wide-eyed, intense way. It was actually a little disturbing. It was as if he feared Johnny would disappear like a mirage if he so much as blinked. What are you doing out here, Mr. Manville? Gosh, I thought you'd live back east. Well, I do, and this is no kind of transportation for I've got to say it, a national resource. Why do you realize that the ratio of drivers to accidents on motorcycles is computed on the road hours basis? I can tell you that because I'm a wolf and we get a circular every month from the National Safety Council, it's one accident per 460 drivers per day. That sounds good, I know, until you consider the ratio of drivers to accidents on passenger vehicles. That one in like 27,000 per day. That's some big difference. It makes you think, doesn't it? Yes, thinking. Did he say something about being a wolf? Did I hear that? Those statistics are pretty what? Well, get it together. You can spend an hour with a hostile bitch from Ms. Magazine, still take a drink, and still not take a drink. Surely you can deal with this guy. He's only trying to show his concern for you, after all. They're pretty impressive, he finished. So what are you doing out here, and on such an unsafe mode of transportation? Gathering material. Johnny found his eyes dropping to the cop's blood-stiffened right sleeve, and forcibly dragged them back up to his sunburned face. He doubted if many of the people on the guy's beat gave him a hard time. He looked like he could eat nails and spit razor wire, even though he really didn't have the right skin for this climate. For a new novel? Pop was excited. Johnny looked briefly at the man's chest, hunting for a name tag, but there was none. Well, a new book anyway. Can I ask you something, officer? Yeah, sure. But I ought to be asking you the questions. So, I got about a gazillion of them. I never thought, out in the middle of nowhere, and I mean, holy shit. Johnny grinned. It was hotter than hell out here, and he wanted to get moving before Steve was on his ass. He hated looking out into the rear view and seeing the big yellow truck back there. It broke the mood, somehow. But it was hard not to be moved by a man's artless enthusiasm, especially when it was decided or directed on the subject which Johnny himself regarded with respect, wonder, and yes, awe. Well, since you're obviously familiar with my work, what would you like What would you think of a book of essays about life in contemporary America? By you? By me. A kind of loose travelogue called Took a Deep Breath. Travelers Travels with Harley. He was prepared for the cop to look puzzled or to guffaw the way people did at the punchline of a joke. Cop did neither. Simply looked back down at the taillight of Johnny's bike, one hand rubbing his chin. It was the chin of a Bernie Wrightson, comic book hero, square and cleft, brow furrowed, considering carefully. Johnny took the opportunity. There was blood on it, all right. Quite a lot. Mostly on the back and smeared across the finger. Ugh. Then the cop looked up and stunned him by saying exactly what Johnny himself had been thinking over the last 2 days. Monotonous desert driving. It could work, he said, but the cover ought to be a photo of you on your drag here. Serious picture. Folks know you weren't trying to make fun of John Steinbeck, or your own self for that matter. That's it, Johnny cried, barely restraining himself from clapping Big Cop on the back. That's a great danger. That people should go in thinking it's some kind of weird joke. The cover could convey seriousness of purpose, even maybe even a certain grimness. What would you think of just the bike? Photo of the bike, maybe sepia toned, sitting in the middle of some country highway or even out here in the desert on the center line of Highway 50. Shadow stretched off to the side. The absurdity of having this discussion out here with the towering cop who had been about to issue him a warning for pissing on the tumbleweeds wasn't lost on him, but it didn't cut into his excitement either. Once again, the cop told him exactly what he wanted to hear. No. Good gosh, no. It's got to be you. Actually, I think so too, Johnny said. Sitting on the bike, maybe with the kickstand down and my feet down on the pegs, casual, you know. Casual, but real, the cop said. He looked up at Johnny, his gray eyes. Really? His gray eyes then back then back down at the bike again. Casual but real. No smile. Don't you dare smile, Mr. Marinville. No smile, Johnny agreed, thinking, guy's a genius. And a little distant, the cop said, looking off like you were thinking of all the miles you've been. Yeah, and all the miles I'd still got to go. Johnny looked up at the horizons to get a feel for that look, and the old warrior gazing west, Harmick, McCarthy kind of deal, and again saw the vehicle parked off the road a mile or two up. His long range vision was still pretty good, and the sun glare had stiffened enough for him to most almost sure it was an RV, literal and metaphorical miles. Yep, both kinds, the amazing cop said. Travels with Harley. I like it. It's ballsy, and of course, I'd read anything you wrote, Mr. Marinville. Novels, essays, poems, hell, your laundry list. Thanks, Johnny said, touched. I appreciate that. You'll probably never know how much. The last year or so has been difficult for me. A lot of doubt, questioning my own identity, and my purpose. I know a little about those things myself, the cop. You might not think so, guy like me, but I do. Why, if you knew the day I put in already, Mr. Marinville, could I possibly have your autograph? Of course. It would be my pleasure, Johnny said. Took out his own pad out of his back pocket. He opened it and paged past notes, directions, route numbers, fragments of map, and blurred soft pencil. These later had been drawn by Steve Ames, who had quickly realized that his own famous client, although still able to ride a cycle with a fair degree of safety, ended up lost and fuming in even small cities without help. At least he found the blank page. What's your name, office? He was interrupted by a long trembling howl, which chided his blood, not just because it was clearly the sound of a wild animal, because it was close. The notepad dropped from his hand, and he turned on his heel so quickly that he staggered. Standing just off the south edge of the road, not 50 yards away, was a mangy canine with long legs and scanty, starved-looking sides. His gray pelt was tangled with burdocks, and there was an ugly red sore on his foreleg. Johnny barely noticed these things. What fascinated him, the creature's muzzle, which seemed to be grinning, and its yellow eyes looked both stupid and cunning. My God, he murmured. What is that? Is that a coyote? The cop said, pronouncing it coyote. Coyote. Some people out here call him desert wolf. That's what he said. Something about seeing a coyote, a desert wolf. Just good. This idea relieved him, even though a part of his mind didn't believe it at all. The cop took a step toward the coyote, then another. He paused and took a third. The coyote stood its ground and began to shiver all over. Urine squirted from under its chewed-looking flank. A gust of wind turned the paltry stream to a scatter of droplets. When the cop took a fourth step toward it, the coyote raised its scuffed muzzle and howled again. A long, ululating sound made Johnny's arms ripple with goose flesh and his balls pull up. The cow part 4 is done. Wow. Oh, they're just going to be on my mind today. We're going to stop there for a little bit. They're not going to stop barking. I'm not sure what the barking's about. What are you guys barking at? No idea. I don't see anything. But, hey! I'm talking. Hello? Thank you. Alright. Really? Seen him earlier. We're playing rough. Harley! Hi, Phoebe. Harley. Harley! Phoebe. Hey, come here. Come here. What's going on, huh? Alright, now that I've got a minute, or not, I don't know. That's why I'm getting offline. Anyway, I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you for joining me for parts 1, 2, 3, and 4.5. We've still got quite a bit of part 4 to go, and then part 5. This chapter is probably another 30 pages long, so hopefully we will get through those the next time I read. It all depends on my voice. So if I have no voice, I won't be reading. If I do have a voice, I will be back. I need to get something to eat and feed my munchkins, and, well, they're adults, but yeah. Down! Anyway, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys for following me. Thank you for watching me. Thank you for joining me. I love you guys. You're the best.